I trust you all can hear me. Welcome to our webinar. I would like to say hello to everybody. But I have to adjust my volume, I think, a little. Okay, I hope you can hear me quite loud and clear now. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on peer review processes today. Well, it's me again, Sibylle, your moderator and facilitator, still on board like you all. That's great to see. Today, let me gladly welcome and introduce to you Anthony Camilleri, quality and standardization expert. Here he is. I'm very happy that he's with us today and that he will share his expertise on peer review processes with us in this webinar today. Thanks and welcome, Anthony. How are you?
I'm doing fine, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Nice that you could make it. Great. Okay, in a minute, Anthony will tell us more about peer review processes in the context of quality assurance. But before, let us take a closer look at the current task on our own quality assurance processes. So let's have a look at the peer reviewing of the group assignments on our open platform of quality in digital learning. So maybe I could show you the first slide. As usual, you know, please post your questions in the chat if you have any, and we will come to them. We'll follow them up. Okay, as you can see, one of the tasks is to share your constructive feedback for other group assignments in the Beta House. You already busily contributing there. It's a pleasure to read your comments. So if you like to receive a certificate, you should share constructive comments and you should continue your comments for at least 2 group results in the Beta House. So your feedback is welcome until Friday. It's the 18th of March. It's the day after tomorrow. And the other task this week is to continue group work. So please revise and further develop your group assignments. Make use of your peers' comments and review and feedback. And you find the peers' comments in the Beta House just below your published group assignments. So deadline for revision is next Wednesday, 23rd of March. And in order to revise, you can use the docs section. So just feel free to use the section docs again in your group environment and further develop your first version document. Please write down within the final group document the names of active and committed group members. That's to say, all members who have actively contributed to the first or the revised assignment version should appear in the final group document. Thank you so much. On my final slide, please let me provide you with some recommendations for feedback, but I'm sure that Anthony will have some more information on that part later on and much more differentiated. But in a short overview, brief overview, we would like to provide you with some guidance. So when you review assignments of other groups, please first give it some time and read the group result carefully. Are the mentioned criteria relevant? Are they complete? Are they described and reasoned in a comprehensive and transparent way? And try to be friendly, try to be clear and specific, and be open to accept other positions and opinions. And last but not least, give your reasoning. I think you all did already in the Beta House, and I would like to share a link with you in the chat window. You should be able to see it right now. Here you can find the peer review guide on the platform to read it all again. And finally, before I leave the stage to Anthony, we would like to conduct another little poll with you. It will just take another minute. And I'm opening the poll right now. You should be able to open. Yes, You should be able to see it now, I hope so. And we would like to know if in the MOOC so far, what did you like most? The learning material and resources shared by experts and peer participants, or the topical discussions and exchanges in the group forums, the expert webinars like this right now, the informal exchanges in the forum park, who is who, etc., the badges and games, the community feeling, the support, orientation, and moderation in the MOOC, the group work on assignments, or if there is something else you liked most, just write it down in the chat. So we already have some results, so that's a good feedback for me to know that you can see the survey. And I would like to provide you with some more seconds. We already have a little more than half of all participants who indicated their most liked issue. So I would like to end the voting in 10, 9, 8, 7, in 2 seconds. And I show the results to you. And I hope I can see them myself. Okay. Great. It's a good, I think you all liked everything. It's a good, a good result for every issue we asked. Thank you so much for this. I hope you could see it. And is there anything in the chat I should know? Okay, very good. So I close the survey and go back and hope that I told you everything I wanted to tell you, and let us now have a look at the topic of peer review processes in a broader context. Let me hand over the microphone to Anthony Camilleri, who I don't hear right now. Maybe he has to activate the microphone again, and who will tell us more about the OpenECB check and the peer review approach for quality improvement.
So thank you very much, Sibylle. Good day, everyone.
Hello.
Before anything, I'd like to apologize. I'm getting off a bit of flu, so I still have a bit of cough, especially to you, those with headphones. I apologize if I torture your ears throughout the presentation.
It's better that you are not directly with us and we cannot get your flu.
This presentation is about peer review processes, and before we get started, I just wanted to make an initial distinction straight away. A peer review process is essentially any process where you are asking your colleagues or your friends or anyone you call a peer to check your work. That's a little bit too broad for a presentation, so we're going to be talking specifically about how peer review process works within quality assurance of learning, and more specifically quality assurance of digital learning. As part of your MOOC exercise for this week, you are being asked to peer review the work of some other groups. While that is another form of peer review, I won't be actually telling you how you're going to peer review the work of other groups, but rather telling you, if you're peer reviewing an entire course, how you would approach something like that. So I just wanted to start off with that so we don't have any confusion. So within a quality assurance cycle, where would we actually use peer review typically? And this is an example of a typical review cycle that's used by OpenECB check, but this is also a review cycle which would be used to certify or accredit a higher education institution or a school or nearly any other type of institution globally. And what it typically involves is that at the beginning you would just have an application for certification, some sort of eligibility check. Then after that, you would probably have some sort of form of self-assessment, which I believe you covered in the first webinar of this series. And once the self-assessment is complete, You would then move on to a peer review, where you send self-assessment to other people, other reviewers, and you would have an external review done of what you think of yourself. In other words, you'd ask some people if something is correct. If this is a certification or an awarding process, usually once a review is done, that might lead to some sort of certificate, some sort of award, some sort of accreditation. We'll be focusing on how you do that specific peer review today. Who do you do a peer review for? Who is the main client? Who is the main beneficiary of a peer review? The answer to that would be very simple. The number one beneficiary of a peer review is the institution being reviewed, the institution who sent the self-assessment. Even if the peer review is being done by an external body to control you, like a national quality assurance body or a local quality assurance body, still the primary beneficiary is always the institution being reviewed. Because the number one result of a peer review in the end is a report on your processes, a set of recommendations to make improvements within your institution. So when looking at this, it really should never be thought that a peer review is being done for the agency that's commissioning it or for the agency that is sending the peer reviewers in. It's being done for the institution that is subject of review. To put this into a little bit of a wider context, talking about what is the overall role of quality assurance and what is the overall role of external quality assurance processes such as a peer review. So within any educational organization, you have a number of stakeholders that actually determine the requirements of the educational organization. In other words, a number of stakeholders will decide what the educational organization does, what type of services it gives. These are usually the students of the educational organization. They are usually the wider society, which might ask an educational organization to give some types of services. And it also, in many times, can be the labor market saying that we need these skills from education and so on and so forth. And these three groups together determine the type of service given by an educational organization. Once educational organization knows what type of services it wants to give, what type of quality criteria it wants to have, it implements an internal quality assurance system to make sure that its institutional policies actually reflect those requirements and that its activities implement the mission. And so it will have an internal quality assurance office or a self-assessment or some type of internal quality criteria which are there to make sure it's actually reflecting the requirements set by those stakeholders. Once you have that step, we then have external quality audits, which is where peer review comes in, where you ask external people to come in and look at your quality system. And what are the roles of an external quality audit? There are two purposes. First purpose is to check the internal quality assurance system. So simply enough, are the controls and the criteria you are using within your organization appropriate to make sure that you are verifying the quality yourself? The other role of the external quality audit is to verify that you're actually doing what you think you're doing. Or in other words, it's to check that you actually are meeting the requirements of the stakeholders, whatever those requirements may be. So when you put this whole system together, you end up with stakeholders asking an educational organization what they want, the educational organization responding to those requirements, implementing checks and balances to make sure it meets those requirements, and external peer reviewers then offering an opinion on the whole system and making sure that is running smoothly. And this essentially is what external quality assurance is all about. It's what peer review in quality assurance is all about. Now, as I mentioned right from the start, there are a number of different types of quality review, of external review. You've all heard, for example, of an audit. Typical example of an audit is a financial audit of a company. A financial audit of a company is usually extremely objective. There are no room for opinions in it. It's based on extremely precise standards. For example, for financial audits, you have, I think, about a 500-page book of rules of how to do your accounting. And it's there to verify the account of the client. So if a company says, these are my accounts, the job of the auditor is to say, yes, these accounts are correct, or no, these accounts are not correct. On the completely other side of the spectrum, you have what you might call expert review. And expert review is what you might find in the peer review for a journal, for example. Now, peer review for a journal is subjective. It's experts giving their opinion on the paper. Usually, you don't have a 400-page set of criteria on how to do it, but rather you will have 5 or 6 broad guidelines on which to assess the article. And the job of it is not so much to verify the account of the client, but to interpret the account of the client and make suggestions for improvement. Now, if we're going to talk about the type of quality assurance you might apply to an educational organization or to an educational program, it's actually somewhere in between. It's what we might call a standards-based view. It is partially objective, partially subjective. It doesn't really usually use broad guidelines. It will have specific criteria, but the specific criteria might be 20, 30 quality criteria, not a 400-page manual. And it is there both to verify and to interpret the account of the client. As we go through the next slides, you'll see how it works in practice. So what I choose to call this, and this is not an official term, this is my term, I call the type of quality assurance review we usually do in education a standards-based review. Reviews need to be conducted by peer reviewers. And what makes a good peer reviewer? This is a slide that's taken from ISO 19011, which have the principles of auditing. And what makes a good peer reviewer are essentially these 6 values. First of all, integrity, fair presentation, which is the obligation to report truthfully and accurately, due professional care, confidentiality, independence, and an evidence-based approach. I'm not really going to go into any of these in much detail. I think they're relatively self-explanatory. Now, apart from needing a set of values, what is the number one skill that's needed by a peer reviewer? First, and obviously, a peer reviewer has to actually be a peer. In other words, they have to be knowledgeable and active in the same subject you are. Within education, who is a peer can be very, very wide. So, for example, in higher education, in universities, we would usually say that professors, teachers, administrative staff, external stakeholders, and students are all peers because they all have stakes in the process and all participate in the process. The other feature you need to be a reviewer is that you need to be a communicator. Because in the end, a peer review is a communications process. And you have to communicate usually with 3 different sets of stakeholders. First of all, when you are a member of a peer review team, you need to communicate with your colleagues, with the other peer reviewers, and you have to create a sort of shared idea, a shared opinion. If you're sending a peer review and none of the peer reviewers agree with each other, you can understand how that would be confusing to the institution being reviewed. Secondly, you are communicating with the institution. If you are reviewing a program, reviewing an entire organization, this is essentially a conversation with the organization where they explain your processes to you and you try and understand those processes. In the case where the peer review is being used as part of an accreditation or certification process, then you will also have an accreditation or certification body, which I choose to call an accreditation agency. And in that case, you have to take the opinion of the institution, which you have put together as a peer review team, and then you have to convey that opinion to the agency in a way they will understand it simply, which is usually the hardest piece of the job, because you might have spent days and days talking to the institution and with the review team, and you have to find a way to summarize this into a few pages while capturing all the issues. And for this reason, I will be talking a lot about how to write an effective peer review report, which can actually do this. So, communicating with your team, a couple of tips. The most important of which is a concept called intersubjectivity. I was mentioning to you already that a standards-based review is somewhere between an objective review and a subjective review. Now, most people would say that a purely subjective review isn't really useful scientifically. On the other hand, when you're looking at something as complex and diverse as an educational organization or educational programs, it's pretty much impossible to make a purely objective, purely criteria-based review which can actually be useful and actually be fair. So what we do is use the concept of intersubjectivity, which essentially means that if you have different experts from different fields with different backgrounds and different experiences, and they all look at the same object, and they all agree on what it is, and they all share the same opinion, then you have a measure of objectivity. Or rather, you have a measure of what we call intersubjectivity. On the other hand, if 6 people who are all experts look at the same thing, and even one of those experts disagrees with the other 5, then maybe they're looking at it from a different perspective. And by finding a way for those 6 experts to agree, and by saying, listen, if we're all experts and we're all looking at something, it's impossible that we think it's something different. By finding consensus, you actually come to a more objective viewpoint. So one very, very important thing when you're doing peer review is that peer review requires consensus between the reviewers. And a lot of reviewers think consensus is just a diplomatic nicety because it looks bad if you disagree in front of the institution. Actually, consensus is far more important than that. Without consensus, you don't have this measure of intersubjectivity leading to further objectivity. So consensus is not a diplomatic nicety. It is an essential prerequisite for quality. I'll now say a few words about communicating with the institution. And the main way you communicate with institution is through a self-assessment. So you will have completed, or rather the institution will have completed, a self-assessment exercise. We'll usually have filled in quite a lengthy report or quite a lengthy form where they give opinion on all the criteria, on all their processes, on everything you need to evaluate them. One thing I need to stress to you about self-assessment is that self-assessment is not a one-way exercise. When, as a reviewer, you start reading the self-assessment, you need to ask yourself 2 important questions. First of all, has the institution told you enough to allow for a successful review? If the answer is no, you need to send that self-assessment back to the institution and say, we need more information in points A, B, and C. Otherwise, you can't do your job as a peer review properly. Secondly, you need to say, what don't you understand and who can answer your questions? Now, depending on the type of review you're doing, if you're doing a document-based review, it might be a matter of listing some questions and emailing them back to the institution. In a type of review that involves a site visit, this would mean designing a schedule of who you need to meet, who you need to interview, and designing an interview schedule for the entire institution. Now, when you're reading through the self-assessment report, and when you're trying to understand the institution, no matter what quality label you're working for, no matter what set of standards you are using, there's, let's say, one general principle which sits above everything and one thing you are always looking for. And that is a completed quality cycle. I believe some of the presenters before me will have showed you a variation of this diagram, but this is what's called the PDCA cycle, which basically means that a quality cycle should start with a plan. After you make your plan, you should implement your plan. After you implement your plan, you should check if the implementation is going properly and find out where it isn't, and then act on the results of that check, or in other words, correct things that aren't going the way they should be, and make changes. From several years of working quality assurance, pretty much all institutions will show you a big set of plans, and they will tell you everything about what they're doing. When you tell them how are you checking what you're doing, what type of internal quality assurance are you applying, are you using surveys, are you using key performance indicators, are you using things like this, again, you won't necessarily find as much information as for the plan and do, but you'll find a fair amount of information. And usually they will have reporting and indicators and so on. But for any of this to be useful, you've got to use those evaluation reports to actually improve the product, improve the service. So then you need to find evidence of actually how the institution systematically takes those results and acts on them. Not just one or two examples, because everybody will always have one or two examples. You have to look for the processes and procedures they have in place to make sure they act every time on that feedback. And the reason you see this diagram in green, yellow, and red is simply enough because the plan and do is usually easy to find. Institutions tend to suffer more on the check, and the hardest part, which means is usually most of your work, is on the act. And that's where you have to focus a lot of your efforts. If you're wondering about the Japanese in the middle of the circle, that's just because PDCA originally comes from TQM, was originally written in Japanese, so it just makes the diagram look a little prettier. As you're going through the self-assessment, and as you are verifying the various parts of the self-assessment, you will have a quality standard. So if we're using, for example, ECB check has about 60 different questions which is asked in the self-assessment, and you as a reviewer, you would be going through each one of these questions and looking at the answers provided by the institution. For each of these criteria, you will need to verify, are there issues for further exploration, including features of good practice? Was enough evidence provided? Do you need to ask for more evidence? And then, of course, you need to offer an opinion on actually, is it compliant, non-compliant, or are there opportunities for improvement? But we will get to that in a moment.
Maybe I would like to interrupt you right here. Please excuse me, but there are some questions, and maybe we can deal with them now, because it's a little on the current slide and the slides before. Juby asked, consensus could also mean compromising some elements, and also Barzan asks, consensus, is it 2/3 yes?
Okay, I can take that by showing an example. When we're talking consensus in this sense, we actually mean 100% of reviewers. There's an example I like to do. If I hold up my phone like this, and I bring 3 mobile experts to ask which model of phone is this. If you're all looking from this level, they might say this is a Samsung whatever, but they might actually disagree amongst them, because there are actually 2 or 3 different phones that have this back. You need somebody looking from a different perspective, this perspective, to say, this is that specific model of phone. And even though 3 were insisting it was a certain model and only 1 was insisting the other, it was actually the guy who had this perspective that had the most information. So without those four people talking to each other, explaining their perspectives, and then agreeing 100%, you don't have that level of objectivity. Because the general assumption is if somebody is an expert in the field, they have sufficient evidence, they've discussed the evidence, they shouldn't be wrong. So if you're in a situation where you're looking at the same evidence and you have two completely different opinions on what it is, somebody is wrong and you've got to figure out where the issue is. And that's essentially what we mean by intersubjectivity. From my experience, in 99.9% of the time, experts will always find consensus. Sometimes it takes more time than others. There are extremely rare cases where this is not possible because the criteria haven't been written properly and there actually is more subjectivity in there than there should be. So it is possible, but in nearly all cases and with most mature quality systems, it should always be possible.
Okay, thank you for that nice example. There's another question by Torvik. He asks, can we draw a line here between accreditation as institutional review and audit of an institution and peer review as individual of an individual's work? So far, the presentation is mostly on the first, right?
If the first was institutional certification, yes, we are talking mainly about institutional certification here. As I mentioned at the beginning, the point of the presentation wasn't really to talk about peer review of individuals' work. It's within a wider quality assurance structure of how to actually quality assure courses or programs or institutions.
Okay, thank you. And Hedda is asking if there is a special procedure for self-assessment, a document to be consulted, which I might have overlooked. I think she...
This will depend on the quality label you are looking at. So there are a number of different quality schemes for quality in digital learning. I believe that if at the week 1 materials in the open house, there are several examples of different quality criteria. There's also a report giving examples of what's about 40 different quality systems for digital learning around the world. It's not my job to tell you which one is right, but every one of them has a self-assessment and a peer review process, and it's essentially up to you which model of quality you feel you want to apply in your institution. Yes, either way, each one of those, there are some things you will always find in them. You will always find a list of criteria, or what are essentially questions, and you will always find a list of supporting evidence you need to give. At the end of this talk, I will be showing you one example of a self-assessment grid, which will be from the ECB check model.
Well, great. Thank you so much. So I think we can continue, and I will collect further questions.
Okay, so probably the most important part of peer review is to actually write your report, to communicate with the agency or to communicate to the institution that is wanting the results of your peer review. And how you do this and the words you choose to do this are extremely, extremely important. Now, first of all, a couple of principles. You've all heard the expression, I don't know anything about art, but I know what I like. Unfortunately, there is a quality assurance corollary. And that quality assurance corollary is, I don't really know anything about the standards, but I know quality when I see it. To this attitude, and anything, the more senior the person doing the review, the more likely they are to actually say this. And my reaction to this is no, 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 no. For the simple reason that every one of those 35 quality labels I was just talking about has its own perspective of quality, has very specific criteria, which it is the job of you as a peer reviewer to evaluate against. It is not your job to give your view of what you think is quality. It's your job to verify the criteria of whatever quality label you are looking at. And I can't stress that enough. terms of how you judge or how you rate the various criteria. Now again, each different quality label does this a little bit differently, but generally there are 4 levels which will always apply, and this will fit into any benchmark, any grading system of any set. At the lowest level, you have simply enough does not meet the standard. To put this informally, it means you're terrible, you failed, like there's just no way you meet this standard, it's like 100% wrong whatever you're doing. We don't use that often, but you find cases where you have a criterion. For example, you might have a criterion, does the program use media? And it's entirely text-based. So there, it's not an opportunity for improvement, it's definitely not good, there's just nothing there, so does not meet standard. The second level up, and probably the most important and the most useful, is requires improvement. In other words, there's something there, it could be better, and here's a recommendation from us to do it better. So let's assume the criteria was uses interactive media where appropriate. And you're looking in it, and there are all sorts of random videos taken from YouTube and sounds from SoundCloud and so on. But it looks like that whoever designed the course has more or less just Googled anything with that term, throwed it in, and didn't really put them in any sort of sequence. There you could give a recommendation for improvement. Great that you're using media, but maybe you should look at the storyline a little bit better. And that is valuable feedback. The next level up is that it meets the standard, uses media well. You look at it, you say, yes, this course is actually using media well, so it's fully compliant with the criterion. Now, even though it's fully compliant with the criterion, there is always minor scope for improvement. One general principle of the quality cycle is there's always scope for improvement. So even here, you would usually be giving recommendations for improvement. It's just that these are recommendations to make a good thing even better, not recommendations to become good. And finally, a lot of quality labels will give you surpasses standard. In other words, this is not just good, it's excellent, it's a best practice which should be shared with other people. And actually, many quality labels have a way of collecting these ones that surpass standards and distributing them, either as papers or at conferences or in databases and so on and so forth. So that is always quite useful. What I'm going to go through in my next slides now are a few ways to, to write statements, and I'm going to be explaining to you the good way and the bad way to write sentences in ways that don't give good feedback and in ways where the feedback can be useful. So in your report, the first thing is that you should always be yourself. You are there as a reviewer looking at a set of things. You should always speak in your own voice. So you should never say the institution showed or the program showed. You should be saying I saw or the review team saw or found or observed. Central here. Be specific. So you might say the institution showed this or the review team found, but maybe you didn't find one example. If you say you just saw or you just say you showed, but how much did you see? How much did you show? It's much better to write the review team found multiple and consistent examples of this practice. That's a much clearer statement and gives you an idea of what sort of review has been done. Another example. Say what you know, don't overinterpret. As a reviewer, there's always some point where self-assessment reports are usually long and complicated, and at some point you will nearly always find some fact that doesn't agree with some other fact. Usually just because the report is too long and the person who is writing it just got confused somewhere along the way. Now, bad would be to say the institution lied to us because A doesn't match with B. A much better way would be to say the review team found inconsistencies between this evidence and this evidence, or between this evidence and this interview. Because what you're sure of is that you found an inconsistency. You're not actually sure if the institution lied, because to do that you would need to prove intent, and you are not able to prove intent. Another example, it is important to give your opinions. As we were talking about this concept of a standards-based review as somewhere between purely subjective and somewhere between purely objective, and the expert in the middle as the mediator for all of this, it's therefore important to actually give your opinions where you have them. Otherwise, we wouldn't need experts. But here's the thing. If it's your opinion, you have to say it's your opinion. Because the standard of evidence between a fact you can prove and what you suspect is different. So you would use phrasing like, we suspect, it seems likely that, given the evidence available, and phrases such as this. Because again, your opinion as an expert is valuable, it should just be clear it comes from you. Also important, this is from my first grade math teacher. My first grade math teacher was always like, you can't just put the answer to the sum, you have to show us how we did it. It's the same in a quality review report. You can't just say, in the end, we haven't found quality in this institution. You have to say that, having considered fact A, fact B, fact C, we find it impossible to say that there is a properly functioning quality cycle. For example, we have lots of plans, but we haven't found a systematic process to act on feedback. That could be one example of something given along these lines. Linked to it, and this one is a complex one, you should always link effect with cause. So a bad example of this would be to say, quality systems are in place, but there is no evidence of iterative improvement. So what you're saying here is that you've got quality systems, and you're saying we haven't found evidence of iterative improvement. Okay, but it's much better to say that the quality system isn't effective because we haven't found evidence of iterative improvement. And you see how the second one, even though it's subtle, is giving a very, very different message than to the first sentence. Finally, in your report, be clear, be specific, be exact. Unfortunately, this is from an institution I actually visited, but bad would be to say the physical conditions of classrooms are in need of improvement. And this is exactly the sort of thing which quality assurance reviewers often like to write. It's sort of diplo-legal politeness. But if what you saw is that classrooms are in a dismal state, there's no heating, broken desks, and no boards, making it impossible to learn. If you change it into techno-speak and say the physical conditions of classrooms are in need of improvement, that doesn't sound anywhere near as accurate as the second phrase. So this is why it's important to be clear and not to write everything in this technocracies that actually hides statements. If anybody has any questions on reporting, this would probably be the moment. I hope I'm stealing the mic from you, Sibylle.
Yeah. Okay, thank you so much so far. Our participants are very, very happy with your examples and with the presentation. It's really, really great. There are only a few questions. Mike, for example, says, I think peers like the diversity they see, and sometimes they adjust their benchmarks too as a result of encounter with programs to institutions that surpass standards. Could you share a word on this?
Well, in short, you're right. To widen it slightly, one of the problems of every quality review system is that actually different groups of peers, no matter how well you try and harmonize the teams, will always have different levels of experience. And somebody who's only done peer reviews, for example, in 2 or 3 institutions exclusively in Europe, and somebody who's been to 30 institutions on 5 continents are going to have very, very different ideas on what constitutes high quality and what is the best and what is good and what is average.
Okay, thank you.
There's two answers on this, though, on how you deal with it. The first is read reports of other peer reviews from teams in the same quality label that came before you. It gives you an idea of where they see it, how they evaluate it, and lets you harmonize. The second part of the answer is when you're doing this for an agency or when you're doing it for a certification body, they usually have a awarding body or inspection body or check body that will actually read the report and do that harmonization themselves. And they might come back to you as a team and say, listen, compared to the other 10 reviews, you're a little too strict or you're a little too easy. So usually there are some sort of procedures in place to harmonize, and there is something you can do yourself as well.
Okay, thank you so much. Deschamps, she's asking, I would like to hear about improvements if a quality criteria needs it. Maybe you could share another example on this.
Okay, I'm not sure what you mean by if a quality criteria needs it. Do you mean what type of recommendations for improvement can you give?
I don't know, she's typing right now. Yes.
Okay, so let me just think about it for a second. Okay, I'll give a very big one, which is also a very common one. When you are reviewing institutions and checking their quality and checking their quality systems. So, for example, most universities will have some sort of student questionnaire they give out to their students. They'll collect the results from that questionnaire and they'll make a small report with like the opinions of students in the course and the suggestions of students in the course. Then you ask the institution, do you actually use these reports? Do you actually implement them in practice? And the institution will tell you, yes, we do. And then you ask them how, and sometimes the examples are not as good as you wish. And one of the very, very common recommendations for improvement you would make in that case is saying, listen, once the report is done, you should introduce a rule in your university that that report has to be considered by the program board and they have to give an opinion on it and they have to decide whether they act on those recommendations or not. And that would be a typical recommendation for improvement to improve the quality cycle, for example.
Okay, thank you so much. There are 2 more questions. The first is Andrew. He asks, how do you get credibility when you are starting out?
Oh, if I knew the answer to that. As a peer, there are a few things, though, which will increase your credibility. First, being an expert in your field helps. So, for example, if you are reviewing e-learning programs, having experience in instructional design, or having published articles on e-learning, or having been a practitioner in e-learning, always helps. Secondly, to be a good peer reviewer, you usually need to have a breadth of experience. So if you've only ever worked in your institution and that is the only type of experience you have, it's more limiting than if you have understood and you know examples from 3 or 4 different institutions. Either you went there as a visiting lecturer or as a student or as a stakeholder and so on and so forth. Thirdly, it always helps to have some knowledge in quality assurance theory and quality assurance processes. The type of knowledge you actually get from a course like this, so if you get your badge, that helps.
Okay. And Philip, he asks, do you know if there is an example of graduated peer reviewing in the context of schools and universities?
Philip, I'm not familiar with the term of graduated peer reviewing. I'm sorry, you'll have to explain what you mean.
In the meantime, maybe I could show the poll. That would be maybe the moment. Share results. Can you see it now, everybody? Okay, thank you. So we made use of that little break while Philip is answering, I hope. Philip, what do you mean?
In the meantime, I had one statement I was saving for, let's say, the last point, which I think is very good to make, also seeing some of the chat that is happening.
Yeah.
And it's one thing I would like you to always remember as peer reviewers. I saw the discussion going on in the chat about politeness, and I couldn't agree with you more. Unfortunately, being polite too often is used as an excuse not to say what needs to be said. If something isn't working, it isn't enough to say, listen, you just need to improve a bit. If it isn't working, you need to say it isn't working. I didn't actually start in education. I started from the sciences. And like in engineering, you will always be told there is no process, absolutely no process that does not have errors. It is okay to say something is not working, because then it can be fixed. And engineers are usually thrilled when they find errors, because it means they've actually found the error, which they knew was going to be there, and they can get rid of it. And no matter how good an institution is, there is always room for improvement. The absolute worst thing you can do as a peer reviewer is say, good, good, great, good. Because then some poor guy has spent days filling up a self-assessment report for you to tell him good. True. For your recommendations. So that I cannot stress enough.
Yeah, thank you so much. Philip answered, I mean, where the peer reviewing leads to an official certificate in a university.
Okay, I could give you hundreds of examples of peer review leading to certificates. So you've got various types of ones. So in Europe, for example, every single higher education institution in Europe has to go through an institutional review, where there is a system like this to accredit the entire university to be able to offer degrees. And then every program within that university also goes through a similar review. And these are usually done with on-site peer visits of 3 or 4 experts coming and grilling them, like thesis defense style. You then have another category of peer reviews, which are subject-based. So, for example, in the field of economics, you have EQUIS, you have AACSB, I can't remember the name of the third one at the moment, but you have these triple accredited MBAs, for example, all of which have gone through these sort of processes. Then you also have specialized peer review ones, such as ones which are for digital learning, for e-learning, and so on. You have the Open ECB check, which I'll be talking to you about shortly. You also have the labels offered by the European Association for Distance and Teaching. The European Students' Union offers one for student-centered learning. So there's actually an extremely wide variety of these types of certifications which can be gotten depending on what you're after. One thing I should stress, there is no such thing as international accreditation or international certification. And unfortunately, there are hundreds of accreditation mills which say we give international accreditation. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing. It's always just individual organizations or individual authorities certifying you that you are compliant with their set of criteria. The only type of accreditation which exists is at national level.
Okay, thank you. So we still have 5 minutes, but I think we can make a few minutes more, because I have one more question, and after that we could complete the presentation, and you have a little journey. You're going to do a little journey with us, Anthony. So first, let me ask this final question by Chamika. He asks, in the process of course accreditation, we used structured checklists to make unified review. Is it a good way to do quality audit?
Sorry, I had to think about that one for a moment. Personally, I have a very mixed feeling about checklists, and honestly, if you get a bunch of quality experts in the room, they would probably spend a day arguing about this. So don't take this as a definitive answer. I would say that checklists are a partial part of the solution. For complying to a set of criteria. So, for example, if you have a set of steps you're supposed to go through to design a course, for example, set the learning objectives, prepare the storyline, prepare the media, do certain checks on the media. these are ideal for this level of quality assurance. Checklists are great to make sure you've gone through a set of steps. Now, if you're taking a more deep self-assessment or self-evaluation, where you are saying, okay, how could I have done these steps better? Then for that, you're going to need free text to add on to it. Same thing when you're looking at the review. There are a number of things that can be checklisted. Have the learning objectives actually been written in the course? Yes. Is the grammar correct? Yes, and so on. But then when you start getting to, are the learning activities appropriate? Again, you can write a number of criteria which are yes/no ones. But at some point, you will always get to the state where you're going to need at least some level of free text, some level of recommendations. So what I would say is absolutely use checklists because they are more efficient, but I wouldn't use them as the only quality tool you have in the institution.
Okay, thank you so much. So if we make use of the last minutes, but as I've said before, we can make five. I think we can make 5 minutes more. It's fine with us. Okay, so let us continue. Anthony wanted to show us.
Yes, I was about to ask you, would you like me to show now, or are we waiting for more questions? I got slightly confused.
No. Yeah, okay. No, there are no more questions for the moment because we have to take a little look at the time. And I would like to suggest that we finish the presentation and make a little journey that you have prepared.
Okay, in that case, throughout the MOOC, you've been hearing on and off about a tool called ECB Check. And ECB Check is a tool for self-assessment and peer review designed by a number of international organizations together. And it actually is an online tool to do self-assessment, and you can also apply to have your courses peer reviewed by independent experts, and which will give you a certification. And I'm not sure if it's been launched already or will be launched next week, but there will be the opportunity as part of the MOOC to actually fill in some self-assessments in this tool, so that you understand what it looks like and how you work with it. I'm just going to do a very short screencast, show you the website very quickly, and show you how to log into the tool. So let's see if I get the right button. Share my screen. And I have to share the full screen of Screen2.
Yes.
Now, you should be seeing my screen. This is the ECB Check website. Now, on the ECB Check website, here in the first bar, you find information about the various parts of it. On the network, you can learn about all the organizations taking part in it. I won't bore you with that at the moment. On the self-assessment, if you're the type of person that likes working offline, you can download the set of ECB Check criteria as an Excel sheet. And I'm just downloading it live and opening it up. Here it comes on my Excel, and this shows you what the criteria look like in the Excel sheet. So you see these are a number of criteria divided for assessing programs. And for each one of them, it gives you a criterion, it gives you a description, questions for your evaluation, and it gives you a space for comments and documentation. Now, however, the really cool thing about ECB Check is that you don't really have to do all the work in an Excel sheet, but rather we have actually developed an online tool to allow you to do this as an interactive process and to create and download learning reports. To do that, you go to the main page and you log in or you register an account here under Assessments. I'm already logged in. I mean, if you register, you take into a registration form or to a login form. I already have it open in another window, though. So once you've logged in, you have this part will change into an assessments and a take a new part. So depending on if you're going for a self-assessment of a course or a program, you can click on one of these. I'm going to use course. And here you put in the information about your course, and then you move on through the various steps. So these are the ECB check criteria. So for example, this is a self-assessment form. So I'm not sure who it was that asked, what does a self-assessment form look like? This is what a self-assessment form looks like. Here's the criterion. All information potential learners need to orient decision about taking the course is available. The description explains what we mean in a little more detail by that criterion, and there's some guiding questions for you to answer. Does the description of the program provide all relevant information for potential learners? In the box, I would give my answer thinking about my program and describing it. It also says the following documents should exist. In this case, a program or course description, which you upload. By going through it, by filling in the self-assessment, and you can see there are a number of criteria on the list, you get an idea of your entire course, you get an idea of if your course actually matches the criteria. This service is free, you can use it, and once you've done it, you can download it as a report for your own evaluation, for your own improvement, for your own use. However, if you fill it in and you say, listen, I've gone through it, I've done my self-assessment, I think this is good, I would like to get this certified. An ECB check actually offers certification as a service. It is against payment, but not a lot, and you can find more information about that here. This is not an infomercial. But if you want to have it certified, you then click on the Apply Now button, and you just say, the self-assessment I did in the tool, you give us the name of the program, and you will be contacted back with the name of 2 reviewers who would go through it and actually do a peer review of your self-assessment, where for every single one of those criteria, they would give you non-compliances, areas of improvement, and best practices. So I think that's enough of an explanation about the ECB check tool. I would be glad to answer any questions about it, or you can contact me in the MOOC platform or by email if you have any other questions about it.
Very, very, very good. Thank you so much for this inspiring and nice presentation. I think we have made it very well. It's only 3 after, it's 4. No, at our place it's 4 o'clock and 3 minutes we have made more. But I would like to say to everybody now that we will see each other again next week in another webinar, but we have a webinar series then, and we will keep you informed about the details. And thanks to Anthony, it was a really great presentation and much informal and very, very informative. Thank you so much. Have a nice day. Have a nice evening. Bye, Anthony. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Sibylle. Thanks, everyone, for participating.
Bye-bye.